much of my life, traveling has been a kind of spiritual practice for me, in the sense that I become more aware and awake to my surroundings and God's presence in ways that I hadn't before. Of course, there are sights to see and cultures to encounter, but for me, there has been an ability to focus on the present in ways that seem a little bit more difficult at home and familiar. You know, when laundry needs to be folded and dinner needs to be made and kids need to be tickled. These big-eyed moments in travel are the places where I tend to notice details perhaps missed when distracted or in those familiar places. Many of these details include innovative ways to construct or engineer an item. In Kenya, I watched kids use a soccer ball made out of plastic bags all wrapped together with twine. There were other folks who didn't have access to toilets, and so they put it in a bag and made flying toilets and let it go. Innovative, you might call, or just gross, but anyway. In Uganda, they make necklaces out of recycled newspapers by rolling little bits of newspaper into beads. In Ecuador, there are people who bike with bananas. They have a long pole and bunches of bananas hang from their bike as they roll down the street. And when I was just outside of London at the cathedral in Canterbury, this area that was fully bombed during World War II, the cathedral in frames stood, and they built a new one where art from all over the world was gathered. And in there was a bust of Jesus that had been constructed from a car wreck accident. The frame that had crushed a child was built into Jesus by a mother. As a lifetime Girl Scout, I find these expressions really incredible and resourceful inventions. I can also see Jesus in this innovative, imaginative spirit and expression. As we hear Jesus promise, "I will build my church," it's worth considering the unlikely materials he used. Jesus wasn't concerned with the color of bricks or the energy-efficient windows. Jesus' church was and is to be made with the salt and light of the world. In other words, the beloved people of God, the confused, uneducated disciples, the outcasts of society, the dismissed citizens, the feared foreigners, the sick and unable, the slaves to masters, both human and otherwise, whether addictions or in trafficking, the undernourished, unfinished, imperfect, you and me. Jesus built his church with unlikely materials. They didn't have to agree or look like each other, have the same political, theological, or ideological persuasion, eat the same food, or even like jazz music, like I do. These unlikely materials would and do need to recognize personal gifts and limitations while seeing that of others. A nose and a foot might both smell, but in completely different ways. And since Jesus Christ has the power of love, relational position, and purpose-filled intention, he constructs the links, the bonds these unlikely materials are held together with. He can smooth rough edges, change and fully transform the material from the inside out, renewing these unlikely materials for the good of the church. Christ continues to build with confident hope as we embrace what the Apostle Paul reminded us of, that was ours to claim, that rich and glorious inheritance in God's power. Jesus Christ chose and continues to choose the materials for his church, as unlikely as they may be. The Gospel of Matthew describes Jesus telling the disciples, and specifically Peter, that they would be the start of the church. Peter, which means rock, in Greek, is chosen. On this rock, Jesus says, I will build my church. Now, no building constructor would be in business very long if he or she didn't know the quality and insist on near perfection of the material products, right? Jesus, however, seems to be unconcerned with blemishes and imperfections, starting with Peter. Peter loved Jesus dearly. You know, he defended him both in verbal and physical fights, but he was also the very one who denied Jesus at the most vulnerable time of his teacher's life. Peter recognized and risked his own life and limb by naming Jesus as Christ. See, Peter would have been crucified for blasphemy. In fact, that was the fate he would eventually face. He would also be considered a fool if he was proved wrong. Still, he insisted. Peter insisted that Jesus is Christ, the anointed Messiah. And yet, he also insisted that Jesus should try a different way than fulfilling his mission by bearing a cross. To which Jesus quickly said, "Get me behind me, Satan." It's a kind of a paradoxical relationship, right? A dear loved one and also someone that could be in his way. Like all of Christ's unlikely materials, Peter had strengths and weaknesses, all of which was incorporated in the church. Jesus chose other specific people as his unlikely materials. The Samaritan woman at the well was one of the wrong tribe, the wrong gender, and had the wrong behavior for most of her life. But Christ redeemed all of her story in such a way that she became one of the first evangelists. Like an open door, she invited and convinced the whole village to come into God's promise and love, to become the body of Christ. Mother Mary was poor and uneducated and pretty young. Apostle Paul was way over rich and certainly well-schooled. But with or without power and prestige, God brought these unlikely materials together for the growth of the church. And God is not done. You are chosen. I am chosen. We are all claimed alongside the other unlikely materials throughout history to be the church. This coming week, we'll begin our home gatherings to share our stories, our concerns, our dreams and questions, and even our hesitancies as we live as the body of Christ together. Peter couldn't hide his true self from Jesus, and I value similar vulnerability. I pray, too, that I can offer that vulnerability to you. Who knows what we'll discover about one another, our quirks and all, right? Maybe you have a special collection that you want to share, or perhaps you have a craving for karaoke. Maybe just an infatuation with shoes. I'm not sure. Either way, we'll get to know one another. I've been able to meet a handful of folks whose very selves and history make up the foundation of this church, of Stevensville United Methodist Church. This includes Sue Cunningham, who, with her late husband George, continues the Methodist roots in this town, which goes all the way back to their own grandfathers, who were Methodist ministers. And Ben and Bev share their faith moments with regularly as a part of 7 generations in this church. Alongside these saints and all of us, we will learn about one another, and we will learn about each other's strengths and limitations. In our home gatherings and my pastoral visits, I'm grateful to be a part of your lives. And I recognize that I also have lots to learn. And so I'm gathering a transition team as well to help me grow in leadership and in partnership with you all. If I believe anything, it is that I can't do this job without you as a congregation. More importantly, I can't do the life of faith and action as a Christian without brothers and sisters journeying with me in encouragement, accountability, sharing needs and hardships, and ever refocusing on Christ's call in our lives. As the lineup grows for this team of unusual, unexpected picks, I know you'll find me on the roster. Human with strengths and limitations as any other, I'm as unlikely a material that Jesus chose as any. I'm Methodist, born and raised, and here in this church I found delight and confidence and an expression of loving God and loving others early on. Even as a youth person, I sensed a gravitation toward ministry, specifically as a pastor or a missionary. But in college, I became so much more aware of what really goes on in this world we live in. I realized the depths of suffering and injustice, the deep hurts and physical anguishes that people endure every day. The junior year of my college experience, I was in a big auditorium watching the movie Hotel Rwanda. Anyone familiar with that movie or that story? As you can imagine, it was quite a juxtaposition because I found myself in plush red seats, air conditioned all around, watching a scene unfold before me of complete destruction, violence, and hate toward brothers and sisters. I couldn't quite rationalize how these two worlds, the world I was living in, that world, existed in the same. And somehow, in that moment, I thought that being a pastor just wasn't enough. I needed something more tangible or more practical to offer to the world. I looked into being a nurse. I thought about being a physical therapist. I finished even physics 2 to go that far. I thought maybe being a business manager or a nonprofit organizer to support people in efforts in East Africa would be a more practical, more appropriate way to be in ministry with God. See, I was always reflecting on systems and seeing how they were working and not working and where gaps might be. And at the same time, I continued to be curious about God's mystery in my life and in the world. I was ever tugged to help cultivate space and intrigue for people to encounter the holy in order to know their worth, belonging, and purpose. So as unlikely as I thought I would be to serve God in this way as a minister, rather than with a medical kit or a business plan, God had just the right role, just the right place for me in the church. Perhaps because of my own journey into this understanding, I care greatly about process toward a product. I'm also sure that our personal stories shape our beliefs and our behaviors, even while many of us just want belonging, a desire that connects us together as humans, as a faith community. So belong we will, Jesus promised. Belong we will, as we are all children of God through faith in Jesus Christ. In this inheritance, we can name why Jesus took all these unlikely materials, including you and me, to build his church. First, we're blessed to be a blessing. Apostle Paul says, as his heirs, God's promise to Abraham belongs to you. When God sent Abram to leave his family for Canaan, he promised him 3 things: land, ancestors, and a blessing. This was a partnership that was forged between God and Abram, for God couldn't bless anything or anyone without first being blessed by God. Thus he and we are the conduits of this promise. We also become recipients of blessing from others who are similarly blessed and are sharing that gift. It's a partnership with God and a mutual experience with each other to know and appreciate. We are blessed to be a blessing. Now, Jesus chose unlikely materials for a specific purpose, not to build an army or a large-scale global corporation or an empire to rule over others. He built a church in order to be the conveyor of healing and peace. In the Roman Empire, during Jesus' life, the leaders gained power through violence. This had been the MO, so to speak, for a long time. And this violence took many forms: military violence, economic oppression, stealing land, resources, and security from anyone and everyone they could exploit, and more. Jesus led and found power and influence in a completely opposite way. It was the power of humility and peace. These different methods and forces resulted in different allegiance, obedience, and trust. Even kids get this, right? They respond to these dynamics. They are so much more motivated with encouragement and love, affirmation, and even proper boundaries than violence or anger could ever help them understand. To this way of life, to this powerful force through peace, Jesus calls us to be a church. And finally, even as unlikely materials, the lover sees what is in the beloved. In fact, the lover, the Holy One, sees more in the beloved than the beloved even knows. With this deep insight, the lover pulls out the potential and offers it to the world. We are chosen and used because our God, the great lover, sees our potential and place in the whole fabric of the church. Fred Craddock was a famous preacher and professor, and he tells a story of going on vacation with his family to Tennessee. Now, Fred was hoping to get away from all the work, including everyone's stories, but inevitably he would run into folks, and they would ask him what he did. I'm a pastor. Oh, well, I've got a preacher story. I'm a professor of preachers. Well, I got another preacher story. He was really just wanting to lay low. One morning, he and his family went to a local restaurant for breakfast, and there again, he tried to avoid eye contact and enjoy his vacation just as a regular guy. He noticed a distinguished-looking white-haired gentleman passing through the crowd, connecting with the visitors and shaking their hands, and eventually this man came to him. Hello there, where are you folks from? We're visiting from Oklahoma. Well, welcome to Tennessee. It's great to have you here. What is it that you do? Hoping to shorten the conversation a little bit, Fred offered this answer. Well, I'm a professor of homiletics. Oh, you teach preachers how to preach. Great. I got a preacher story for you. And so the man sat down and pointed out the window toward the mountains and said, you see those mountains? Well, just at the base of those mountains was an unwed mother who gave birth to a son. At the age of 6, this mother couldn't take care of her son anymore, and so she gave him up to the orphanage, where he lived a rather hard life. When he went to school, he felt ashamed by the question that was always haunting him, who is your daddy? And so he kept to himself. He didn't have many friends at school, and he rarely went into the community or to shops. Although he went to church on a regular basis, he always started late and left early, hoping to avoid the crowds and the sideward looks. Well, one morning, a new minister was in town, and he was given the sermon, and the benediction came so fast that this young boy couldn't get out fast enough, and he was caught in line with everyone else. He made his way to the